The desert was cold after midnight. Wind pushed sand against the canvas walls of the surgical tent, a steady whisper beneath the distant thunder of artillery fading beyond the hills. Lamps burned low to preserve fuel. The air smelled of antiseptic, dust, and blood carried in on uniforms that had not seen water for days. Stretchers arrived without pause. An American medic lifted the tent flap and motioned forward. The next stretcher did not carry a familiar uniform. Field gray, mud hardened across the boots. A young German infantryman stared upward, breathing in shallow bursts, waiting. No one spoke to him in anger. No rifle was raised. Instead, hands pressed against his wound to slow the bleeding. A tag was written, not a prisoner number, a medical priority. He was moved ahead of an American soldier whose injuries were less severe. Around him, surgeons worked without looking at insignia. Only the injuries mattered. Only time. For the first time since the war began, the enemy did not shout. They tried to save him. And that moment only made sense because of everything he had been told before reaching this tent. German infantry training in 1939 and 1940 emphasized endurance, obedience, and movement, but just as important was expectation. Instruction films and briefings warned repeatedly about captivity under the enemy. Allied nations, they were told, did not truly follow international law when facing Germany. Leaflets shown during training described beatings, starvation, and revenge for the First World War blockade. The message was simple: capture meant humiliation, and often death delayed rather than immediate. For young recruits, this was rarely questioned. Many had never met an American. Britain existed only as a distant bomber threat. France had fallen quickly. Poland had vanished behind them. Experience reinforced the narrative that resistance worked and surrender did not. Manuals existed explaining how prisoners should be handled. But soldiers at the front rarely read legal documents. What they absorbed came from repetition, posters in depots, lectures before transport, and stories passed down from veterans returning from earlier campaigns. Each retelling made the outside world harsher than reality. On the Allied side, a different system had developed. A wounded enemy soldier still required guards, food, transport, and paperwork. A dead one required burial teams and identification. Practical reasoning aligned with law. Stabilizing prisoners quickly reduced long-term burden. It was administrative efficiency supported by international agreement. Field manuals issued to American medical units before deployment into North Africa were direct. Treat according to urgency. Record nationality after stabilization. Separate later. Yet this doctrine remained invisible to German troops across Europe. For them, the enemy was theoretical, a figure described through ideology rather than experience. By late 1942, that separation ended. After Operation Torch in November, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. For the first time, large formations of the United States Army entered direct ground combat with German units. The distances of the Atlantic no longer insulated either side. Patrols met in valleys and across ridges of a landscape neither fully understood. The first clashes were confused, equipment unfamiliar, signals misread. Units moved according to different operational habits. And when casualties began to rise, something else occurred quietly behind the lines. The first transfers of wounded prisoners into Allied medical stations. They arrived expecting interrogation first. Instead, they encountered orderlies. The implications of that would only grow as the campaign deepened toward Tunisia. By February 1943, the war in North Africa had narrowed into a tightening corridor of mountains and dry riverbeds across western Tunisia. The Axis forces, German and Italian, were no longer advancing, they were holding. Supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean under constant air attack. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer be fed. Then came the fighting around the Kasserine Pass. American units, newly arrived and still learning how German formations maneuvered, the battle produced heavy casualties on both sides in a short span of time. Aid stations designed for hundreds received thousands. Evacuation chains collapsed under distance and terrain. Trucks carried wounded men beside ammunition because there were no separate vehicles left. Medical officers were forced into decisions not anticipated during planning. Tents were raised wherever ground could be flattened. Lighting was reduced to avoid drawing artillery. Instruments were cleaned, reused, cleaned again. Surgeons operated until their hands trembled from fatigue. German panzergrenadiers. Uniforms mixed together before names were known. Identification papers were often missing or blood-soaked. Language barriers mattered less than visible injury. Chest wounds could not wait for translation. The triage system simplified reality, immediate, delayed, expectant. Nationality never appeared on the first line of the tag. Medics collecting casualties from contested ground encountered a practical truth. Reaching the wounded required temporary ceasefires measured not in agreements but in exhaustion. Soldiers from opposing sides sometimes pulled the same stretcher across open ground because neither could carry it alone under fire. Once behind cover, procedure resumed. Weapons were taken, bandages applied. For many German soldiers, capture happened in stages. First came shock after explosion or gunfire. Then transport in vehicles marked with symbols they recognized but did not trust, red crosses painted on canvas and metal. They expected interrogation upon arrival, instead they were sorted by bleeding. Inside the field hospitals, beds were arranged by surgical priority. A German soldier awakening after anesthesia could see an American on one side and an Italian on the other. Orderlies moved between them without pause, repeating the same checks. Pulse, breathing, temperature, in the same rhythm. The overcrowding removed privacy and also removed distance. Men heard each other's pain, prayers, and sometimes attempts at conversation through gestures when language failed. Rumors began forming almost immediately. At first they sounded like misunderstandings. Someone believed they had been moved ahead of an Allied soldier in line. Another noticed his boots had been placed beside the bed instead of taken. A third realized his wound had been dressed before questioning began. Small details, accumulated faster than official explanations. Commanders worried about security, but medical necessity overruled separation during critical hours. Guards stood at entrances, not between beds. The priority remained survival until transport to rear camps became possible. Within days, the hospitals themselves became places of unexpected observation. And what the prisoners observed there would begin to change the purpose of captivity from fear into uncertainty. For most captured soldiers, the moment after injury was the most dangerous in imagination rather than reality. Orders shouted in an unfamiliar language. Rough handling meant to establish control. Boots were cut away from swollen feet. Blankets were placed without comment. The predictability unsettled prisoners more than violence might have. It suggested they were not being singled out at all. Many prisoners waited for the moment when treatment would stop and questioning would begin. It did not come. Surgeons rotated shifts. Nurses recorded temperatures. Orderlies replaced bandages already soaked through. Men raised within systems that stressed loyalty above survival struggled to interpret indifference to nationality. Gradually, their behavior changed. Instead of watching guards constantly, they watched routines, meal, distribution times, dressing changes, the quiet signals staff used to communicate across crowded wards. Allied medical doctrine required a kind of emotional discipline. Surgeons could not afford preference. The triage tag decided order, not personal history. Less urgent fractures waited even if the patient was a compatriot. When mass casualties arrived, thinking about allegiance consumed time that patients did not have. In practice, this meant enemy soldiers sometimes reached the operating table sooner than Allied infantry lying beside them. Medical teams understood the psychological effect, but could not alter the system without risking collapse of care. Consistency protected both patients and staff. Once exceptions began, arguments followed, and arguments slowed treatment. Records from similar hospitals show the same pattern. Nationality entered documentation after stabilization. Identification came second to pulse. For prisoners witnessing it, the logic appeared extraordinary. Frontline medics carried a responsibility unique in combat. They crossed ground still dangerous to retrieve anyone capable of survival. Under fire, distinctions narrowed. Reports from North Africa described moments, not always, but often enough that retrieval continued. Medics sometimes discovered the wounded they reached wore unfamiliar insignia only after turning the body over. Training required they continue anyway. Once evacuation began, The wounded became cargo requiring protection more than threat requiring restraint. Weapons were removed quickly, then attention returned to hemorrhage and airway. Carrying a wounded man a kilometer across sand was labor regardless of nationality. The effort itself dissolved much of the abstraction of the enemy. And those carried him began to understand that the first Allied soldier to touch them had not come to capture, but to keep them alive. A hospital that became a place of retaliation would destroy surrender as an option. And without surrender, every engagement would last longer and cost more lives. So, written and verbal orders were repeated to guards assigned around surgical tents: security outside, neutrality inside. Even intelligence gathering followed medical clearance, because premature interrogation could push staff into conflict with their own troops. This was not idealism, it was prevention. If wounded prisoners feared death after capture, they would continue fighting until physically unable. That meant more ammunition spent, more artillery called, and more Allied casualties retrieving them later. Preserving the reputation of medical safety shortened resistance in later encounters. Medical chiefs answered simply, saving the most urgent case first saved total manpower later. Prisoners stabilized earlier required fewer guards and fewer emergency evacuations. Policy became habit. Habit became expectation. German soldiers entering captivity carried a structured certainty about the enemy. They expected revenge, especially from forces they had been told were inexperienced or angry after early defeats. Water offered without questioning. Personal effects placed beside beds instead of confiscated immediately. None of these acts required speeches to communicate meaning. Prisoners compared experiences quietly among themselves. Another noticed a nurse returning repeatedly to check circulation in a bandaged arm long after danger passed. An Italian artilleryman realized his identification card was returned after recording rather than kept. They still expected transfer to camps, but the immediate threat of execution faded. Some began assisting orderlies with translation gestures or basic tasks, not from loyalty but from reduced tension. They listened where surgeons had no time. Many patients did not share language, but tone carried reassurance. When deaths occurred, identification was recorded carefully regardless of uniform. Markers were placed, coordinates noted for future recovery. Prisoners sometimes witnessed this through tent openings or during transport. The effect was profound. Death handled with order suggested life was valued with equal seriousness. Even soldiers who held firmly to ideology recognized procedure when they saw it repeated without exception. In letters later written from rear camps, but governed by rules that did not change day to day. And once rules replaced fear, the meaning of captivity began to change, setting the stage for the moment, when survival itself would alter decisions men thought they had already made. Late March 1943 brought a surge of fighting along the narrowing Axis perimeter in Tunisia. Air attacks intensified, retreat routes shortened. Units compressed into defensive positions where artillery could reach them continuously. Casualties rose faster than evacuation capacity. On one afternoon, a concentrated bombardment struck positions on both sides of a contested ridge within minutes of each other. Vehicles sent forward returned overloaded. Some carried men stacked shoulder to shoulder, separated only by uniforms stiffened with dust and blood. The distance to the nearest surgical clearing station was too short for sorting in transit and too dangerous for delay. They arrived together. Inside the hospital perimeter, staff had no time to separate nationalities before triage. Stretchers were laid in rows across open ground outside the tents. A surgeon walked the line, marking tags in quick sequence: airway, bleeding, consciousness. Orderlies followed immediately behind, redirecting bearers to different entrances. German, American, Italian, the operating tables filled simultaneously. A collapsed lung required intervention within minutes. Decisions were visible to everyone capable of lifting their head. At one table, a German infantryman was anesthetized while an American artilleryman waited for his turn with a less urgent injury. No explanation was offered. None was needed for the staff, but it was unmistakable to the patients. The workload forced openness. Curtains could not be closed in the heat. Voices of surgeons calling for instruments carried across the tent. Medical terms replaced national ones. Blood types mattered more than regiments. As the hours passed, the rhythm stabilized. The most critical cases moved from immediate danger to monitored recovery. Some regained consciousness while others were still being operated on nearby. They witnessed the sequence with clarity sharpened by exhaustion. Guards remained at the entrances, but their posture changed. They no longer watched for violence. They managed movement to keep pathways clear for incoming stretchers. For prisoners able to speak, the question repeated in different words but identical meaning, why treat them first? No formal answer was given. Treatment continued. By nightfall, survival rather than allegiance had defined the entire day, and those who lived through it would carry a memory strong enough to alter what they expected from the next morning. Morning revealed the scale of what had happened. The sand around the hospital perimeter was marked with hundreds of boot prints, wheel ruts, and darkened patches where stretchers had rested during the night. Inside the recovery tents, the sound had changed. Fewer urgent commands. More low conversation. Metal instruments no longer struck trays in rapid rhythm. Wounded men woke not to interrogation but to routine checks. Bandages were loosened to restore circulation. Water was rationed carefully and passed from orderly to patient in the same measured amount. Identification was requested only after temperatures were recorded and pain managed. The sequence did not vary. For several prisoners, the realization arrived slowly. They had seen Allied soldiers wait their turn while surgeons worked on enemy casualties. They had heard staff refuse to move a critical patient despite requests from armed guards to prepare transfers more quickly. The authority inside the hospital clearly belonged to medical necessity. When transport officers arrived to prepare evacuation to rear prisoner facilities, hesitation appeared. Others asked questions through gestures and fragments of shared words. When would dressings be changed? Who would continue treatment? Whether they would remain under the same doctors? The concern was not confinement but departure. Guards interpreted the behavior first as confusion, then as reluctance. Similar requests followed from others recovering from surgery who feared interruption of care during movement. Military protocol required transfer once patients were stable enough for transport. Beds were needed for incoming casualties, and rear camps were prepared for long-term recovery. Yet the reaction revealed something unexpected. Captivity had become less threatening than return to uncertainty. Medical officers explained procedures carefully, dressings would continue, records would travel with them, and Red Cross inspections monitored conditions. Even so, several men resisted loading onto trucks until reassured personally by staff who had treated them through the night. No speeches were recorded, no declarations made. Only a visible pause as former enemies preferred the predictability of the hospital over the unknown beyond its boundary. By the time the convoy departed, the reputation of that place had already begun traveling ahead of it, carried by men who no longer described capture as the end they had once feared, and that change would echo through camps and reports far from the Tunisian front. The reports from the field hospitals reached headquarters within days. Official dispatches noted the number of casualties treated, supplies consumed, and surgical outcomes. But buried in these records were subtle observations, statements from prisoners, the conduct of guards, and the unexpected behavior of men recovering from severe wounds. Red Cross inspectors arriving in late April 1943 recorded detailed notes. They described orderly wards where patients of all nationalities received equal care. Nurses followed strict schedules. Surgical teams rotated shifts with minimal interruption. Posts were observed assisting staff in minor ways, guiding each other through the medical routines when language barriers appeared. Inspectors emphasized that morale, not only survival, had improved markedly among captured personnel. Letters sent by German soldiers back to their families also captured the unusual experience. One infantryman wrote that he had expected the worst upon entering captivity, but instead they treated me like a human, not a number. Others remarked on the nurses, often recalling their attentiveness and calm demeanor under pressure. These accounts circulated among prisoners in rear camps, slowly challenging the expectations instilled by propaganda. Even Allied soldiers took note. The war was still brutal, but in moments like this, the humanity of both sides could manifest. For commanders, it reinforced the practical advantages of adhering to medical neutrality. Not only did it comply with international law, it also reduced the likelihood of resistance and disorder among the newly captured. This first section of the aftermath highlighted the immediate operational and personal consequences. Prisoners' fear was replaced by cautious trust. Staff morale stabilized under immense pressure, and documentation confirmed that treating the enemy with impartial care could save lives on multiple levels. As the wounded were moved to rear camps, the effects of the hospital's impartial treatment rippled outward. Prisoners carried stories not of brutality but of care. Hans Weber, Otto Reinhardt, and Marco Bellini later described in letters how nurses returned to check bandages repeatedly, how surgeons refused to prioritize friends over strangers, and how chaplains offered quiet guidance without favor. These accounts were unusual enough to be noted by intelligence officers compiling assessments of enemy morale. Within the camps, cooperation improved. Prisoners assisted in camp maintenance, aided each other with language and logistics, and complied more readily with routine orders. Commanders noted a measurable reduction in minor infractions and confrontations, concluded that seeing Allied impartiality had a practical effect. Soldiers who expected cruelty instead experienced structure, fairness, and predictable routines. Fear gave way to cautious trust. Reports from the Red Cross later corroborated these changes. Inspections highlighted improved hygiene, less conflict among prisoners, and more orderly medical requests. For Allied soldiers, the same documentation confirmed that humane treatment did not compromise security. It strengthened it. The posts who had once begged to stay in the hospitals now understood that discipline, order, and fairness could coexist even amid war. Psychologically, the impact endured. Letters and testimonies circulated long after the Tunisia campaign, shaping the perception of Allied forces among POWs. Many veterans reflected that the memory of being treated equally influenced their behavior once they returned home, challenging the wartime propaganda that had painted the Allies as ruthless. The ripple effect extended beyond individuals. By demonstrating that impartial medical care could save lives, maintain order, and subtly influence the enemy, these hospitals became a quiet testament to the strategic and moral value of humanitarian conduct in wartime. This balance of law, ethics, and practicality set a precedent for subsequent campaigns and the handling of captured soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. In the quiet that followed the Tunisia campaign, the meaning of those field hospitals became clear. They were more than tents and stretchers. They were a demonstration of humanity amid a war defined by destruction. Each carefully bandaged wound, each measured dose of water, each repeated check of pulse and breathing was a small defiance of the expectation that the enemy must suffer to survive. For the Axis prisoners, the experience reframed captivity. Fear, once instinctive, gave way to cautious observation. They learned that life could persist even under the control of those they had been taught to hate. That revelation, silent and simple, became a cornerstone of trust that carried forward into rear camps and, in some cases, reshaped personal understanding of the war itself. For the Allied medics, the principle was never abstract. Their work was necessity, duty, and discipline converging. Yet, in the rhythm of surgery and care, they glimpsed a quiet victory. Saving lives regardless of uniform was not only lawful but strategically effective. The neutrality of medicine became a subtle weapon, capable of changing hearts, fostering compliance, and reducing future suffering. History often remembers the battles, the strategy, and the losses. But in the sands of Tunisia, beneath the canvas tents, the quiet insistence on equal care left a mark that transcended numbers. It proved that even in the machinery of industrial war, empathy and professionalism could create moments of profound human consequence, moments strong enough that men begged to remain where compassion, rather than violence, ruled. The story of those hospitals stands as a reminder. War may test the limits of human cruelty, but it can also reveal the enduring capacity for humanity to assert itself in the least expected places.